Okay, we're going live. Fatima, you may start. Hello, Fatima. Can the other speakers hear my voice? Okay, it seems that maybe there's a trouble of connection from Fatima. Maybe allow me to first start the session while waiting for her. Hello, colleagues, and welcome to one of our regional webinars from A3T. I welcome you all and greetings. My name is Nadine Sherani. Here sitting, not standing, here sitting as the A3T Secretariat. Maybe a brief introduction regarding A3T. It stands for the Asia Alliance Against Torture. So what is actually A3T? A3T is actually a collaborative movement from CSOs across Asia in order to abolish the acts of torture. So here we have several CSOs like here from the Advocacy Forum from Nepal, and then we have Contrast from Indonesia, we have Swaram from Malaysia, and many other CSOs, including Musawi, Pakistan, who is also our moderator for today, as well as our speaker for the day. So I welcome you all. In regards to our regional webinar, it is a part of a series of webinars that we hold within the 18th of June until the 28th of June. Now, the main purpose of these 11 for this 11 series of webinars is to commemorate the International Prevention of Torture Awareness. So here, within these 11 webinars, we provide 11 themes in regards to torture and the current issues that revolves around it. So maybe as seen in the poster also from A3T or other CSOs, as well as maybe if some of you follow the Milk Tea Alliance Twitter, we have from violence against women themes, we have the medical legal documentation theme, and many other themes for the rest of 9 more webinars, including this refugee session. So that is just a brief for me. Fatima is back on stage. I will give the microphone back to Fatima. Fatima, you may.
Thank you so much, Nadine, for taking over. I apologize. It has become quite customary now, because of internet connections. But thank you all for your patience, and thank you everyone for joining us. We have a very exciting conversation, which is extremely relevant in general to the region, but also in particular in the COVID-19 context. And what we're going to talk about is really the impact that the pandemic has had and the risks that has posed to, refugees, stateless communities, and migrant populations spread across Asia. And I'm joined in this conversation with a panel of experts that has, their own unique expertise and experience in working with these groups, and we'll share more insights on that. But Nadine, I'm not sure if you briefly introduced A3T already, in which case I can do that. So
I sure have, but Fatima, you may have the floor.
Okay. Sorry, because I lost you, I'm just making sure. So as Nadine may have already mentioned, the Asia Alliance Against Torture is a regional initiative of 11 organizations in the Asia region across 9 countries. And we've come together really to talk about, issues of impunity of torture, prevention and accountability framework for torture and other forms of cruel, inhumane and degrading treatment. And, really to explore in our themes of webinars and internal conversations with partners to assess that what is some of the disproportionate or, added layers of vulnerability for marginalized groups when we talk about torture. And so we've already had a conversation on the impact of women and violence against women. And I think one of the groups that we identified is also these refugees and stateless communities and migrant populations. So we're very excited to really just start this conversation, you know, and to see to what extent that can, you know, relate to, you know, and build into our, you know, anti-torture work. So I will really briefly introduce my colleagues, and I think we'll start, you know, with Rana, if that's okay. And Rana is a barrister, and she is an Afghanistan consultant with the Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network. She has a lot of experience in working with different communities across different regions and countries. So that, you know, that is also one of the insights that we will be taking from Rana. And then we have Sevim with us, who's Director of Programs at Musavi and a lawyer, and Shahida Parveen, who is yet to join us, I believe. So we can introduce her to all participants when she joins us as well. Additionally, so Rana, just really over to you, starting off our conversation. We really just want to have sort of, you know, a reflection of your insights, any thoughts on what you have identified to be the impact of, you know, refugees, stateless communities that you've come across, migrant populations, you know, in the countries that you've worked. What has been the impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic on them in particular? We have, of course, seen that the pandemic brought with it, and of course, data is a huge challenge when we talk about migrants and refugees and stateless communities, and also patterns of movement. But we do know, for example, that, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic brought with it restrictions, border controls, you know, restrictions with regards to mobility, both internally from urban to rural populations within a country, but also externally, you know, with tighter restrictions, and also, you know, reports coming from different countries of abuse, you know, that they have faced in trying to come into a country, but also in escaping terrible persecution in their home jurisdiction amidst the pandemic. So over to you for your insights on this. So yes.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute delight to be here. So thank you very much, Fatima and Nadine, all of you, the experts among us who are here today talking about this very important issue. And one of the reasons I'm particularly excited is I think that there is a lack of overlap communication between our various spheres, particularly when we're looking at refugees, migrants, stateless persons. We often aren't looking at closely enough at anti-torture mechanisms and opportunities to increase protection. And I think this is a great opportunity. I think I'm very excited to have come across A3T and see your great work, specifically in the Asia Pacific. And maybe it would help if I said a little bit about our organization, APRIN, the Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network. We are a network of over 200 organizations and individuals, civil society organizations, refugee-led initiatives, national and local NGOs in 38 countries now. And we all focus on refugee rights and advancing refugee rights in the Asia Pacific region. So some of you will know us. But I think some of our main areas of focus are sharing information and resources, capacity strengthening, and joint advocacy. So I think one of the important aspects of our work perhaps is to try and take ourselves out of these silos that we often operate in, and look at the ways that we can more effectively increase protection to these particularly marginalized groups, refugees, migrants, stateless persons. And we at APRIN we work across the whole of the Asia Pacific. I am working myself specifically on Afghanistan at the moment, but I also have a history of working in Thailand. And our focus as an organization includes Rohingya, Myanmar, non-Rohingya communities, and various and Afghanistan, and various thematic groups. So we cover a wide range of issues across the whole of the Asia Pacific. And of course, I'd be very happy to hear from any of you if you want to reach out. I hope Nadine or Fatima could provide my contact details and we can collaborate further. I think one of the, obviously looking at the impact of COVID, as we've all seen, there have been some, for the most part, hugely negative impacts on the refugee migrant communities. And I think it's COVID-19, the pandemic saw a deterioration in protection and rights for refugees. The things I think we will focus, I would like to focus on more of the issues of detention, indefinite detention, overcrowding in detention. These were particularly bad in this last 2.5 years. Thailand and Malaysia, I'd like to talk a little bit more about. We saw lack of access for visitors, and lack of access to legal advice, medical care. INGOs essentially stopped operations or paused operations during those times. And so we saw a lot of informal protection or access also stopped. I think we have seen, and I'd like to deal with that a bit later, some unexpected positive outcomes. And I think we can take heart from that. I'd like to give you an example, particularly now, of in Thailand, we have as we kind of been seeing this in the media, and it's been led recently, and there's been a recent public statement by the Uyghur Human Rights Project and other organizations calling for the release of the Uyghur population in Thai prisons, in Thai immigration detention. This particular group that I would like to highlight, a group of 52 or so Uyghur individuals who've been detained since 2014. They remain in detention, and they were detained, as I understand it, under the Thai Internal Security Act. And so obviously they've been in detention a long time. They were in detention pre-pandemic, detention throughout the pandemic. What we've seen is access very difficult and very sensitive. You know, there've been no, during the pandemic, there've been no visits and no sense of in terms of detention or no sense of when this detention may end. So this sort of psychological impact of indefinite detention. And also, and therefore, you know, in the sense, in this particular group's case, the length of time in which they've been detained and the lack of clarity over the detention, the lack of any clarity over resettlement, lack of communication with other organizations or with other communities within the detention center. So that isolation in and of itself is arguably inhumane and degrading treatment. And not least the potential risks upon refoulement or return to their country of origin. So these kind of cases, I think, are particularly worrying. And I wanted to highlight, because I think COVID has also seen the securitization under the guise of COVID response and the withdrawal of basic humanitarian support. So all but disappeared. So unfortunately, I would say, in particular in relation to populations in detention across Southeast Asia, we haven't really seen a return of those rights since the pandemic. Arguably, we're seeing other measures being relaxed in relation to the pandemic. We're not really seeing a return of refugee rights to those in detention, which I hope is something that we can work towards together. I'm kind of trying to be more positive about what is a very difficult situation for this community. Is like, what potential solutions do we have? What positive steps could we take? And one issue, of course, is potentially using the Convention Against Torture, another criminal, inhumane, and degrading treatment or punishment, so CAT, as a mechanism to seek better conditions for in detention for those who are in immigration detention, say in Thailand or elsewhere. In relation to Thailand, Thailand has ratified CAT, but not the optional protocol. The real problem with these, the mechanics of how one makes a complaint, particularly difficult for refugee and migrant populations. And I think that is the key, that often we don't understand when we're looking at anti-torture mechanisms, why refugees, migrants and stateless persons are so vulnerable. I think, Fatima, you touched on it when you said it's about lack of data. It's very true. It's also lack of access. So in many cases, particularly during the pandemic, and national NGOs and others have had lack of access. One of the ways one would potentially make a complaint to a treaty body is you would need consent from the individuals bringing the detainees, bringing the action. If you don't have access to those detainees, you cannot bring the complaint. So it's also, if they're being held incommunicado, you can't get informed consent. And when you have no consent, no access, it's difficult to move forward. So it's a real challenge when looking at potential actions being taken by these communities, is how do we deal with that? And it's in particular in relation to populations in Thai detention, that is a real challenge. But to be more positive, I would say that Thailand is moving, and perhaps is moving slowly in the right direction in terms of they are a champion country under the Global Compact for Safe and Orderly Regular Migration, GCM. They've set up a national working group to implement these GCM and the Global Compact for Refugees, and they are looking at alternatives for detention, focusing particularly on ending child detention. So that is a positive sign we see in terms of Thailand looking at the legislation and increasing protection to refugees, and that has been going on throughout the pandemic. So although there was a pause in the national screening mechanism, that has been back in discussion and is moving forward. Also, another interesting fact is that Thailand, not just Thailand, but Thailand's another example of one of the number of countries that, in terms of access to vaccinations, was actually very good for undocumented migrants in Thailand and refugees. Those in detention saw a delay in access, but those in the community were given relatively quick access to vaccinations. And that's also the case to sort of switch country entirely in Iran, where we see a large, huge population of Afghan refugees and migrants, where there are many issues and many challenges for those communities. Protection space is poor, but they did get access, and very quick access in general, relatively, in relation to vaccinations, and were not required to produce documentation as to their status when they were being vaccinated. So that was an interesting side effect, perhaps seeing how governments can, when they want, create a space to allow migrants and refugees to operate within their environment. I wanted to talk a little bit, I don't know whether I've got time, but I want to talk a little bit about strategic litigation, and whether we as neutral communities, thinking the refugee migrant community and A3T and others working on anti-torture mechanisms, how we could use strategic litigation to best effect to increase protection to refugees and migrants. And we have, I have an example. I mean, there are a few examples of strategic litigation that have been in recent years, and we also had a strategic litigation roundtable at the UNHCR consultations only 2 weeks ago, where when you look globally, there's phenomenal work being done in terms of strategic litigation for refugee, migrant, stateless communities. But the challenge is how we work together and how we're strategic globally, how we work together. And we're obviously working in isolation, and we often don't know what one another is doing. And we often have challenges of how the government then reacts in relation. But I can give you an example of Malaysia, where in February last year, so 2021, Amnesty International Malaysia and Asylum Access Malaysia jointly filed an action in the Kuala Lumpur High Court to prevent the deportation of 1,200 people to Myanmar. It was a great progress in the sense the court ruled in favour of the detainees, of those individuals, and they ordered the stay of the deportation. However, regrettably, the interim and halt to deportation was, although it was granted, it was then ignored. A few hours later, the Malaysian government handed 1,086 individuals to Myanmar naval ships in breach of the court order. And the next day, the High Court issued an extended stay order against the deportation of the remaining 114 individuals. And the Malaysian government was slow to provide information about the whereabouts of those individuals. And the immigration officials asserted that the 1,086 individuals deported to Myanmar did not include Rohingya or asylum seekers. However, that is contrary to information others have about that particular population. So although it was very regrettable that and very disappointing that the Malaysian government was in breach of the court order, it was a great step in the sense of the court. We actually saw a positive decision from the court. And I think we've also seen positive decisions in India. I don't know whether anyone's going to be talking about India, but just briefly to mention, because our members are across the whole of Asia Pacific, we have another positive decision from the Manipur High Court. The lawyer Nandata Haksar brought a case on behalf of 7 Myanmar nationals, saying they should be given access to UNHCR, should be given access to apply for asylum. And the court ruled that access to asylum is a fundamental right under the Constitution of India under Article 21. And that case is now at the Supreme Court. And there are various logistical reasons, including location of some of the applicants that is preventing that case from moving forward at the moment. There are some interim court hearings. But so it's interesting. I think I would say that strategic litigation has been successful in other jurisdictions. In Europe, in South and Central America, we've seen some very positive cases. In the Asia Pacific, I'm yet to see a real groundswell to see strategic litigation working, but I do believe that it is a way that we could increase protection through anti-torture mechanisms. We have, the challenge will be that some countries have not ratified CAT, and we're not seeing political will for them to do so. But it does it does create a political space, or a space that the judiciary can potentially implement change and put pressure elsewhere. There's so much one could say. I could say about the challenges for people during the pandemic. What I wanted to give one positive example. So obviously it's all been terribly negative, but one positive example has been that when we saw the borders closing in Thailand and Malaysia, we saw Rohingya in particular seeking protection in Indonesia. I'm sure many of you know this. But as we saw them seeking protection in Indonesia, we did see a humanitarian response from Indonesians and Indonesian fishermen. And although that did bring its own problems with cases of smuggling and prosecutions for smuggling, there has been it was an interesting response. Good to see a humanitarian response from Indonesians in solidarity with the Rohingya attempting to seek protection. I'm really happy to answer any questions. As I said, there's a lot more I could say. Many more examples across the Asia Pacific of how protections have been infringed, how particularly in relation to freedom of movement, in relation to detention conditions and length. But I have to leave that there. Any questions, I'd be delighted to answer.
Thank you, Rana. This has been very insightful, and I think that what's been captured really well, I think, from your conversation is just the different opportunities that can stem from also some of these emergency responses, for example, especially where you ended last. And of course, they have a set of their own problems, and there is that temporariness to some of the processes that are in place for refugees, stateless and migrant populations, which leaves these communities to a large extent in a state of indefinite uncertainty, even when there is a positive kind of a legal or policy or administrative development. But nonetheless, I think it's really important within our conversations to kind of keep track of any positive developments that other countries in the region can capitalize in, that can provide avenues for advocacy. Because I am aware, for example, that even with regards to litigation, jurisprudence from some courts travels faster to other courts because there is persuasive precedent. So, for example, the Indian jurisprudence tends to have a huge impact in some of our higher court judgments as well. and the same is the case for Bangladesh as well. And sometimes you can monitor those trends as well. But I think one of the thoughts that I want to put here, and I think then I'll pass it over to Sevim, is I think that the strategic litigation is a very interesting sort of an idea and a tool. And I think that we definitely saw that, that there are cases in the region that have been valuable for refugees. But I think one of the things has really been, what are the prerequisites for kind of thinking about that strategy? Because oftentimes we do see, especially in some of the jurisdictions in South Asia, where courts have such a wide kind of space to do anything, that sometimes, for that to be codified in a legal way can be counterproductive for refugees, stateless communities, and migrant populations. Like, for example, one wrong judgment, or I would say wrong from the standpoint of, a rights-based refugee rights advocacy standpoint, perhaps, but could take you back a lot more than that. But at the same time, if there's a positive development, that could fast track processes. So it's always a very complicated space for human rights organizations in the region. And I know that several members of A3T routinely, have engaged in conversations on strategic litigation with regards to torture issues. But there's always that question of, how do we make that assessment, especially when the communities that we're representing are the added, with the added vulnerability, with the added risks, with already a very limited legal space in which they operate. And so I think I can leave that as like a thought for us to think about in this conversation, perhaps. And also I will come back to the anti-torture framework as well, to towards the other part of this discussion. But over to Sevim now for your experiences with the particular communities that you have been engaging with, in the context of the pandemic, both as it was, but how it has become now. So over to you, Sevim.
Thank you so much. So I will just talk a little bit. Rana, I think some of the points that I want to share definitely will echo some of what you've already said. And I think that's something that is consistent across a number of jurisdictions in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on different populations. I think before I want to go into the impact, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how there's been different impacts on different groups, even within, refugees and migrant populations and stateless communities, for example. So speaking about Pakistan specifically, the impact of COVID-19 has had similar issues in terms of, access to health, vaccinations, access to livelihood. But the way these issues have impacted, for example, Afghan refugees that have permanent resident cards is very different from how they have impacted Afghan refugees with Afghan citizen cards or non-registered Afghan refugees in Pakistan. And similarly, if one were to compare the challenges for Afghan refugees with stateless communities, they would be quite different in terms of how they have impacted the groups. And this has a lot to do with the pre-existing biases or discrepancies in the system itself, which has just sort of been, highlighted during the response to COVID-19. And I think it's a great place to start thinking about what this means for the future as well, and how these impacts can be learning experiences in terms of dealing with different marginalized communities in a more effective manner in the future. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about Afghan refugees first. And the reason for that is perhaps because those refugees that have a permanent resident card in Pakistan have access to, theoretically, a number of rights that most citizens have access to. And so the impact of the pandemic would seem to be similar. However, in practice, this is something that we have not found. Unfortunately, during the 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic, Afghan refugees who did have POR cards were still at the tail end of receiving support, whether it meant in terms of access to vaccination or access to livelihood. So with respect to livelihood, over 80% of registered Afghan refugees in Pakistan work as daily wage workers. And this is perhaps the community or the group of workers that was the most impacted. So for example, if a number of Afghan refugees work in vegetable markets, fruit markets, these are places of work which were shut down entirely. So not only could they not go and, carry out their daily activity, but they also couldn't procure goods, they couldn't store goods, and hence they couldn't make any means in terms of their daily livelihood. So the sort of impact that COVID-19 had for even registered refugees is quite extreme in comparison to a number of other communities within the country. And again, if you compare this to, for example, stateless communities, which don't have any sort of registration phase in Pakistan currently, are not recognized in a number of different areas, these communities have very limited access to livelihood in a general space. And so during the pandemic, they essentially lost any access to their work. So if they were working in, say, a majority of the stateless community in Pakistan resides in Karachi, Sindh. So if they're working in fishermen-related work opportunities, those were limited in terms of their power to buy and sell, just because of the limitations on access to movement in the first few months of the pandemic itself. So one of the impacts I think that has been quite clear and has been documented to a large extent for all of these communities is the access to livelihood during the pandemic. And I think something that connects to that very directly is the response for the same thing. So for example, while there was a number of government and CSO initiatives to support emergency cash and provide rations and related necessity items for these groups, it didn't extend to refugees. There's only one documented emergency cash program which was supported by UNHCR and the government of Pakistan for Afghan registered refugees. There isn't data to suggest that any of this was done at a government level for any of the other categories of migrants or refugees that we're talking about. So that's a really big concern in terms of, none of these measures were extended towards them. There have been CSO initiatives, both on an independent as well as a group basis, which provided some cash. But again, this was not something that was consistent. It was a one-off sort of provision. So the impact in terms of, I think, economic livelihood is perhaps something that definitely has been highlighted at the national level. There's been a number of other issues as well. So when we talk about access to health and vaccinations, in Pakistan, this is something that I think has both good and positive and negative sides to it, like Rana was talking about. So in terms of highlighting the need for more registration, I think the pandemic was one way of learning that, perhaps, or at least talking about that. So the need to document more and more undocumented people within the country is something that definitely came up as a result of attaching vaccinations to registrations and identity documentation. So that's something that was definitely part of the conversation at both the government level as well as, with sector experts during this time. And vaccination drives were extended after several months to refugee populations as well. But again, this was limited initially to Afghan registered refugees, so those who have a POR card, which is a permanent residency card issued by the government. And it did not extend initially to anyone who did not have a registration card. There are reports that the latter strategy of the government of Pakistan did allow for vaccinations of undocumented persons as well. However, there's no information to confirm whether or not or how or what the process was in terms of providing such vaccinations or providing, for example, more than the first dose of the vaccination. Because in terms of how you contact and how you ensure or document vaccinations were being provided, it was all related to the identity documentation. So these are some of the other problems that I think, are worth considering. And I'm sure some of these may overlap with other jurisdictions as well. But these are the two main impacts that I wanted to talk about. In terms of detention, it's something that Rana, touched upon. I just want to very lightly talk about it, which is that detention of refugees remained a consistent problem prior to the pandemic. And there are a number of concerns that were raised by CSOs during this time, which related to whether or not basic COVID preventative mechanisms, such as having access to clean water, such as having hygiene materials provided, were available to refugees or other vulnerable groups who were in detention. There isn't enough data in Pakistan at the moment to very clearly tell us what did or did not happen. But I think there is a presumption that because the situation was present prior to the pandemic, it must have sort of been exacerbated by the pandemic itself. And so concerns of unsanitary detention services and prolonged detention have been raised at the national level as well. But again, we don't have a lot of data on this, so we can't really know for sure at this time. But I think it's something to flag in terms of whether other jurisdictions are able to face similar problems, or whether there is a better way of understanding what interventions did happen in terms of a response to COVID-19. One of the other things that I just want to touch upon is the idea that while there were a number of services that were suspended during the pandemic, one of the major suspensions related to government services with respect to registration of documentation. And again, this meant that refugees or stateless community individuals who had filed for identification documents prior to the pandemic or were going through a process were facing extreme amounts of delay, going up to 2 years, and some are still facing those delays simply because the offices had closed down and there were no ways to actually expedite that process or to continue the process itself. This is something that really did impact access to any of the COVID response strategies at the national level, but it also impacted general ability to access rights, which has been a persistent problem, but one that was definitely highlighted a little bit more during the pandemic because of the restrictions in movement, the inability to get access to work and basic services. So these are just some of the things that I think I wanted to highlight in terms of the impact. And I'm happy to share a few. I'm not sure if you want to wait for that, but I have some points in terms of positive developments during the pandemic, but I'll hand it back to Fatma and then perhaps we can talk about those. Thank you.
Sevim, please go ahead with the positive developments and then I'll take it over.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So just 2 points on this. One of the things that did come out of the pandemic, which I think it's it's a positive development because of the sort of standard it sets in terms of government response in Pakistan particularly, is that the government of Pakistan has a COVID-19 response plan and strategy, which is supported by the Planning and Development Department as well as UNDP in Pakistan. And this is a policy that very specifically, it's the first policy that responds to COVID-19 response and strategy for stateless communities in Pakistan. There is no policy before this that has outrightly accepted or dealt with the response strategy for this community. And two, it has very specific recommendations as well as action points for refugees, and it recognizes the vulnerability of refugees in light of the pandemic, and has recommendations similar to what we just talked about. For example, the plan clearly says that the government should take up the responsibility and obligation to expand the ISAS emergency program, which was the cash provision program in Pakistan, to ensure that COVID-19 households for refugees are also provided the same access to government funds during this time. There aren't other documents that we have seen that have, taken such a strong tone towards these communities. So it's definitely something that we note as a positive development in Pakistan, and one that we think is worth sharing, because even in terms of, whether its implementation is there or not, I think having that document out there, having that policy that states that this is a necessity for the state to respond to, is something that's a starting point, at least for a country that is the third largest host of refugees in the world. So I definitely think that's a positive of perhaps the pandemic, but also it pushes us towards planning for future challenges like this as well. So yeah, that's about it. Over to you. Thank you, Fatma.
Thank you so much, Sevim. I think definitely we take all the positives that we can from the region, and I think there's definitely value to that. I think some of the themes that have been consistent in both experiences that you have shared and experiences that Rana has shared earlier about the different jurisdictions in which she has worked, is that some of the existing problems that refugees have faced with regards to detention, and abuse in the context of detention, have just been exacerbated in the context of the pandemic. And while we do see things, some things turning out for the better, this is still a space where we need to kind of focus more of our attention in terms of identifying avenues where we can maybe jointly advocate for support in these kind of situations. And I think this is something that definitely relates a lot closely to the anti-torture framework when we're talking about death, detention, and custody-related ill treatment. I think all of these, non-refoulement was mentioned. These are all traditionally spaces. But I think one of the things that we have been discussing internally as A3T, and I think that is also perhaps a suggestion or a recommendation as well, is to really kind of think about how we can identify synergies between anti-torture practitioners that are working on documenting, especially in the context where documentation is extremely challenging in the context of refugees, stateless communities, and migrants, and there's challenges of access, that how we can build synergies between practitioners that are doing documentation on torture and other forms of ill treatment in the general context, or with certain other communities, with the refugee rights activists or stateless community representatives and the like. So that, I think, is a bridging sort of a note. But I think I want to really kind of ask a little bit more from our panelists, that if you could share maybe perhaps some insights, and there might not be any examples from your particular jurisdictions where you do think that the pandemic allowed for certain synergies to be created, that kind of opened up new avenues in terms of conversation on refugee rights, on stateless communities, and migrant populations at the national level, but also at the regional level, for example, if that was there. Because sometimes I think that the pandemic has brought attention to certain spheres, and that can be seen as a positive, but that may not necessarily have translated in effective action. So, for example, now I'm really just asking about, I think, what your insights are about kind of what the response has been, not just from the institutional level, but just in terms of the larger communities, what the conversations have been, whether there has been greater solidarity, whether there are any avenues of, people coming together that were not, the, suspected partners. What kind of insights, if any, do we have, that maybe one jurisdiction can learn from the other from in the refugee rights, stateless communities, and other framework? So that is really just a follow-up. And I think here I want to also bundle up with you both together when you start answering, is that what you think should be the case, for example, given that what we've learned from the additional challenges that have been there for refugees and migrant populations and stateless communities, what kind of safeguards are necessary, having learned from the pandemic context, or having learned from some of the challenges that can be posed in similar kind of emergencies arising globally. What is it that we, as a region, need to be prepared for? What nations need to be prepared for? And just your recommendations, really. So I think that is really the next part of the conversation. And I'll start with Rana, if that's okay, Rana, to share any reflections. And I understand, this is not a well-defined space, so of course, I think this is really just to get any of your insights, and there might not be, many examples of that, which might be what we need then in the future.
Yes, I think you've actually hit the nail on the head, as I would say, that it really is we struggle to make those connections. We even struggle within the refugee migrant community, stateless community, to make connections between refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, say migrant workers, and stateless persons. We even struggle with that distinction. And we spend a lot of time, both at Apron and in previous roles I've had, trying to work out ways of how we can better synergize, but where to work together, because obviously we're facing, or communities are facing, very similar protection concerns, actually. So, for example, work rights challenges or access to work, and all the challenges and protection issues that flow from that. So I think that it is something that really did come out in the pandemic, and that these communities were sharing such similar diabolical challenges. I hope this will allow us, and I'd like us to move forward to sort of finding avenues where we say, look, we have these shared issues, we can bring something together, we can bring forward these concerns together as a larger group. And I do think that on a regional level, we at APRIN, I think probably the same with A3T, we do look at things regionally, and we do see parallels, and we do see good practices. And we have seen it as an odd, positive, is that because there was such health, so everybody was concerned, it was sort of, there was a uniformity or a universality about health concerns. And so we did see some countries for the first time in their history put aside this distinction of whether or not you have a residency card or not, or right to remain, and then actually just allowing access to vaccinations and access to healthcare. And then we saw other horror stories where, of course, these things weren't available, and access was delayed or not provided at all. So it does vary, but we do have good practices, and I think that would be a great thing to be doing more collaboration and exchange on those particular examples. I mean, one negative example is this. I was talking to a colleague about the situation in India and Rohingya in India, and how the pandemic really saw a rise in xenophobia, particularly towards the Rohingya community in India. The sort of the misconception that they were somehow responsible for incidents of spikes in numbers, etc. And I think so there's sort of obviously, as always, it's been there've been both positive and negative. And I'm really excited about the potential of a conversation where we are more proactive between our different communities, NGO communities, about what we can do to increase protection to everybody.
Thank you so much, Rana. Thank you. Savim, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, just want to add on to what Rana was saying. So I think it's one of the things that I think most countries still seem to lag behind on, is building that sort of a synergy or a response that is more holistic. I think the pandemic presents a really important learning experience for countries, both at the national but also at the regional level, in terms of how these problems are often cross-cutting. So, for example, with restrictions in moving around borders, that is something that I think for future pandemics, countries definitely should be prepared for, especially in terms of these specific populations that we're talking about: refugees, migrants, undocumented persons. How did this impact? Because the same sort of impact will reoccur. So I think it's really important for regional bodies or regional groups to become more active in terms of integrating risks and plans that are more catered towards future pandemics or future crises that could affect the populations in similar manners. And there are a number of ways to do that. So one of them, is, again, building from the national example. One of the ways is to call for or work towards incorporation of these populations into national and regional response plans, even if they're not recognized as citizens, or even if they don't have a legal status that we generally require. Emergency response plans should be more inclusive in terms of these populations and what is needed. But I think even taking that a step back, in terms of how we're thinking about responding to such situations in the future, we really have to look into those safeguards. So one of the major problems in a number of countries, Bangladesh specifically, during the pandemic, was the situation in refugee camps, or in camps in general, and how that was increasing the number of cases, how that was increasing the severity of the pandemic itself for that particular area. So these are things that definitely, I think, have been highlighted and call for a more holistic approach in terms of our current work. So the work that different bodies, whether it's APRIN, whether it's A3T, the work that we're doing on a daily basis should now become a little bit more open to responding to such future problems, because we can't respond to them in that 1 year or 2 year. We've learned that already. What we haven't done, I think, at this point, is that we have to find a way to integrate this conversation into our existing plans and work to prepare better for such future issues that may arise. And I think, just on one other point, I think that's important, in my opinion, is access to healthcare. I think it's something that we've talked about a lot prior to the pandemic as well, but I think there has to be some sort of a distinction, and perhaps this is something that may require a more regional approach in terms of access to healthcare, specifically in emergency situations, is something that should not be connected to or linked to identification or documentation. It should serve as one of the specific rights that is present regardless. of that. And I think that's something that we should push for as regional stakeholders as well as national stakeholders, because that sort of conversation or that sort of change in narrative is really what can help us build safeguards for the future, ones that we didn't have this time around. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful, and I think that this kind of connects to, you know, some of the themes that Rana was mentioning, right? That the lack of those synergies have been exposed during the pandemic time, you know, when we needed to come together to provide sort of a collective support system, or to provide some responses as a regional entity, or even as national actors in our own spaces, because somehow it transcended what and who you're working on, because there was a larger humanitarian crisis. And I think that you know, this idea, and I think that is also kind of a great recommendation, is that we need to start having these conversations now, to see how better we can, you know, incorporate refugees, stateless communities, migrants, you know, other marginalized communities within our mainstreams of work, to be better prepared to respond, you know, to these challenges in the future. So yeah, that's really helpful. And I think one of the things that also kind of stood out with regards to the healthcare is that in many jurisdictions, I think Rana both mentioned it as well, and Sevim, you did as well, that there was, you know, relaxation on who could get vaccination. So to that extent, healthcare was accessible. But I think I would still be suspicious of looking at that as healthcare, rather than sort of this collective safety measure, you know, where you're like, you know, and we do know that in Pakistan that was the case for stateless communities as well. But, and, you know, we do see also, you know, that where spaces are shared, where services are shared between, you know, low income and high income groups, those services are better. You know, but so I guess I think that I mean, even half-heartedly or for whatever, you know, reasons, that does provide an opportunity. And so if states can do it, you know, when they're pushed to do it, that means that they have finally acknowledged that these populations exist within their territories, those that don't have this identity. And that can be a great starting point for many actors to say, well, we can't go back to the point where we say they're not there anymore. So I think that's that. And with this, I think Shahida couldn't join us today because she's having some network issues. And it would have been very useful to hear more about what's happening on the ground in Bangladesh. But hopefully we can have a follow-up conversation to learn more about that. But I'll open the floor now for any colleagues that have any questions for our panel here. You can write it in the chat box, or with the permission of what Nadine has already raised her hand. So let's start with Nadine. Over to you, Nadine.
Hi, speakers. Okay, this is a bit awkward, but I will add a spotlight to myself. Okay, yeah, I've added a spotlight now. Well, good evening from Jakarta. Very interesting points from both Savim and then over to Rana, and then also some additional points from Fatima also. But I want to make also a highlight that another risk of these refugees maybe have been mentioned before regarding the vaccination, and then they don't have any protection for their economic conditions from economic impact on the pandemic during the condition, and then they do not have also a good access to maintain or just to obtain good education during the lockdowns within the pandemic, which happens to several children who are still gaining their status as student, or they don't even gain any status as student, but they still have the rights to gain the access to education, and etc. But maybe what I want to ask more here is that, one more thing. Also, I think it's still important for the asylum seekers, refugees, migrants, and stateless population to gain not only a basic healthcare but also mental health care, because I see that this impacts during the pandemic has been too much on their plates, and they need additional access to it. That's just my other concern to add up. But maybe one of the things that I want to ask is that maybe we can see here the main thing which creates a circulation or a chain of migrant populations and etc. is because of the xenophobia. So how do you perceive this within the pandemic? Has this we can see that COVID already exacerbates torture for these people, but how do you see xenophobic people within these populations? Does this add up to the number, or does this add to the acts of torture by COVID? Or maybe there are other angles that we can discuss more about this. Maybe I'll just leave it up to you, speakers, and also Fatima. Thank you.
Would anyone like to give that?
Yeah, I can just add a quick comment here. So I think, thank you, Nadine. I think that definitely this is something that has added in terms of an impact. So there has definitely been increased xenophobia in a number of countries. The response towards different communities is heightened by the overall pandemic itself. So it's got that sort of cyclical nature, sort of like violence, where when something bad is happening overarchingly in a country, it's sort of blamed or it's put towards our biases or our internalized discrimination. And so I think that's definitely something that we've seen in Pakistan as well during the pandemic. So for example, there were concerns about increased detentions or increased, stopping and searches of Afghan refugees during the pandemic because of the increased surveillance of citizens across the country and people across the country in terms of their freedom of movement and the restrictions that the government had put in as COVID measures. So those are also those very basic measures which were there to prevent the pandemic also often do create another layer of concern for communities that are already vulnerable and already have specific ideals associated with them. So I think that's something that we've definitely seen to some extent, and I think that sort of resonates with other jurisdictions as well. Rana, please feel free to join in.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to echo what you're saying. Essentially, that's true. I think that's sadly the case, that those internal prejudices, come out, erupt sort of from as xenophobia. We've seen that in various jurisdictions. We see attacks, physical attacks. We see, measures. Even sort of like open public statements by those in authority against particular populations. We've seen also migrant, refugee, stateless populations, often the way they're having to operate work is that they have often been caught as well in breach of COVID rules. So for example, the necessity to work and survive, they maybe breach COVID rules in order to travel to work, etc. So we've often seen that kind of link between criminalization of a community through these during COVID, and they're sort of exacerbating the xenophobia, sadly. I also wanted slightly to go back to your point about mental health, and I thought that was a really excellent point to raise, Nadine. That has been a huge challenge for all communities, particularly those already in precarious situations. And having talked earlier about detention and the lack of psychosocial support and the need for psychosocial support, and looking at the level of the sort of uncertainty and these limitations have caused a mental health crisis. And I think that is something that I would like us all to explore further about how we can better give access. I know certainly in terms of my own project on our work on Afghanistan, Afghan refugees in the Asia Pacific, one of the first asks from individuals who are going through a period of crisis and this period of transit, often in transit, is that they seek mental health support. So it was a really good point, Nadine, to raise that, I think. So thank you for doing so.
Yes, thank you very much. I think, part of this also relates to kind of, Rana, what you mentioned is that, some of the public healthcare response has been deeply securitized, and it involves a lot of criminalization in several jurisdictions. I mean, at least we've seen that in the case of Asia, which made it really important for CSOs, actors, defenders to try to more actively monitor what's happening, because it was like everything was coming under the public healthcare response with no questions asked, and that meant that certain long-standing issues became worse. And so I think we did see in some jurisdictions in the region what appears to be a rise of authoritarianism, but also that the public healthcare response to the pandemic was kind of subsumed into that conversation, just because the initial response was very heavy-handed, without sufficient context to the circumstances or the lived realities of especially refugees and migrant populations. And for example, in India, but also I think in other parts of Asia, we did see a situation of stranded refugees and migrant populations. And it's almost like no one thought about them, like no one even thought about them nationally before the imposition of lockdowns. Like, how would people go from one place to the other if they're migrant workers? So I think these kind of situations have also revealed a lot, about what it is that we need to look at. And so Indrana, please do add here, because you must have definitely experiences to share.
No, I didn't want to interrupt you. I thought you were, it was great. I was just thinking about stranded refugees. It was something that I had wanted to raise earlier and hadn't. Was seeing the sort of complete stop of resettlement. Now, obviously, resettlement is only ever a small percentage of durable solutions available, or ever really available, for refugee migrant communities. But it really did come to a complete standstill during the pandemic, and we saw particularly marginalised vulnerable populations really suffer terribly as a result. I think, yeah, people did not think about the consequences and impact of that. I kind of wanted to bring something else in as well, which was an opportunity that came from that complete sort of stop, the complete freeze on all operations. A lot of INGOs, international NGOs, stopped operating. UNHCR stopped operating. So a lot of, as I said, resettlement opportunities just ceased. But what we did see was that community-based organizations, refugee-led initiatives step in and provide services. And they had always been there, and their information had always been up to date. But I think the larger NGO community, perhaps including UNHCR, started to recognize they fill a need, and they have a flexibility in their work and a knowledge which INGOs don't have. And so we saw the pandemic really, I can think of many examples of where community-led organizations were stepping in and providing support, providing emergency response. And I hope that will mean that we will see a more meaningful response in terms of allowing those organizations a seat at the table, so they can really be taken seriously in terms of their expertise and their ability to respond in increasing protection to refugees and migrants.
Yes, no, definitely. And I think that's really, that has been something very interesting to see. But also just that reiterates the importance of local-led solutions, local-led initiatives, and support. And also because the pandemic physically made it impossible for avenues of support to reach, it really kind of reiterated how much we take this for granted in a way. This global support system of well-established actors. But when things change, then, what do we have on the ground, and how much energy has gone into setting that up over the years to be able to respond effectively to local needs, and how much energy has gone into investing in local citizen-led solutions to problems that emerge within their constituencies and communities. I think that has, and also just refugee-led initiatives and stateless community-led initiatives, and migrant populations solidarity initiatives. I think that has kind of really been out of necessity their protection framework. But at the same time, I think that is something that, is a space where we need to kind of engage more and invest more and think more about the value of in the post-pandemic context. And so, Sevim, do you have I think any more questions from any of our colleagues here that have joined us? I know that we can also talk about this for a while amongst ourselves, but if there are any other questions, then please feel free to write it in the chat box, or raise your hand and let us know, or speak out. That would be okay too. So yes, so Sevim, did you want to add anything on to what Rana had said earlier? On local solutions. So for example, I do know that we have some, some insights in Pakistan also of kind of local solidarity networks and how they've been working, I think also pre-pandemic. But I wonder if you have any insights that you want to add on here.
So I think just in terms of what Rana was saying, Fatma, and again, what you've enunciated, whether it was, the Bengali Action Committee in Karachi, or whether it was these, different representatives from the community that have been doing the CBO-led work. I think one thing that even local organizations that work more nationally realized during the pandemic was to increase their support and reliance and capacity for people who are situated in different places, which included specifically those embedded within the community. And I think that's one of the things that we definitely do take from this, because in terms of economic livelihood and providing emergency cash or necessities, only those people who were part of those communities were able to do it in the initial phase, in the first 4 months of the entire lockdown. So I do think that there's definitely value for this. And Rana, I definitely think it calls for, increasing space for these individuals as well as representatives from the community to come into the broader conversations, because we spend so much time working in a framework that is a little bit more global, perhaps regional, without recognizing that when it comes down to it, sometimes the only people or the only actors that can support that and who have come out to support it in the most difficult parts of it have been, people embedded within the community who perhaps have not had the same opportunity to realize or actualize this sort of work pre-pandemic, just because of the lack of access to, this conversation in a number of different regional and national platforms. So just that. I do want to leave one other thought out there, Fatma, and that's just I'm just interested, Rana, maybe you have some thoughts on this in terms of how we can build. So traditionally the torture and refugee narrative has been limited in terms of its connection to the idea of non-refoulement, but I just wanted to see whether there are more holistic ways for us to move forward in developing some connection that enables us to look at it a little bit more holistically. So what I mean by that is maybe whether we can look at interventions that, whether interventions on torture should include a cross-cutting lens that is dedicated to how it impacts refugees, migrant communities, and stateless communities. We've seen that has worked really well in the case of women, because for women rights, that's something that was adopted very early on by a number of UN entities, which was a cross-cutting approach towards women. Similarly, over the last few years in a number of countries, a cross-cutting approach of, the water, sanitation, health has been adopted in a number of different projects. And I just wonder whether we would benefit from, or whether there are any existing interventions at the regional level that you are aware of that do look at torture with the cross-cutting lens from these vulnerable communities that we're discussing. So just a thought out there, and happy to hear your comments on it.
I would say that from APIM's perspective, we don't have, there is a real lack of that. I think we are cautious. I think also, in terms of what Fatima's very important point, that strategic litigation is something that we have all been very cautious about. And we, given how vulnerable the populations are, we have been looking at this. But we tend to sort of have these internal conversations that don't necessarily result in an action, a group action. I think that's a great point. And I think, for example, I think there are plenty of potential avenues we could take. You know, not just looking at refoulement, non-refoulement, but looking at, as we've talked about before, but detention, the impacts of detention, even the impact of the sort of uncertainty, the impact on mental health, of the uncertainty of someone's existence, how long they are entitled to stay, when they may or if they may ever retain some sort of status. And I feel like there are avenues there, particularly in terms of psychosocial impact, where we should be looking at, and we haven't been. And that's why I'm excited by this potential collaboration, because I feel like these are areas that we need to explore further. And there is this sort of universality of experience across jurisdictions between all of these populations, be it refugee, stateless, migrant, and that we could make better use of it.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that there have been, I mean, I think to a large extent, there still are separate spaces in which these conversations are happening. Of course, there are organizations both within A3T as well that do have had prior work or have ongoing a component of, assessing or supporting or providing services to migrants in detention as part of their anti-torture kind of work more broadly. But I think that there still needs to be that larger conversation of, kind of looking at it together. And I think that, Rana, that point is definitely well taken, that, there's a lot of diversity in the region with regards to acceptance of CAT, for example, but also with regards to acceptance of or having any local law that prohibits or criminalizes torture at the national level. So that has been a key challenge, and many countries in the region still lack any local legislation that would outlaw torture and other forms of cruel and inhumane and degrading treatment in the way that it is understood under the convention. And Pakistan is one example of that. So we, of course, do have creative ways of including, what actually is torture in a way that it could be liable. But I think that it is harder to do that, especially in the absence of a regional sort of a mechanism, which is, acting as an enforcement for any of the countries in Asia. I mean, we have India, we don't have ratification or the local law. We have Bangladesh, which has some positive examples, but we see where things are at the moment. Even countries that do have torture legislation are not able to fully utilize it, in a way that it's working to be able to achieve that level of accountability or end to impunity. So I think it's still important to have that conversation, because there is this general understanding that torture, the prohibition against torture, is absolute, whether or not any country has any law in place or not. I mean, the rest is practicality and how would different countries be able to discharge their responsibility. But I think this is something that we talked about in our women's rights webinar earlier. And again, that question of whether there was value to using the torture language to talk about violence against women rather than gender-based violence or violence against women and girls, or GBV terminology that is, but should it just be called torture? And I think part of the reasoning for why it might be valuable to think of it as torture, which it is, now that it's been internationally also recognized, but is that that level of shame that is associated to what is torture, is valuable in that, right? And I think that could apply also to refugees as well. But I think that we need to have a larger conversation where we take input from all the different actors to see whether this would be a viable mechanism. But even from an advocacy standpoint, I think to start to build this recognition that what refugees and stateless communities and migrants are experiencing is torture, or up to that severity level, whether or not there's a legal framework to recognize that, or whether or not there is a legal framework which they can rely on to access that. And I think that's more of this advocacy, but also in terms of allowing stakeholders to see what other avenues that they can use in the existing setup. I think so. And I think this is just a preliminary conversation for us on this, but we definitely will, try to develop those type of synergies, as A3T as well, and as members within A3T, to see how we can kind of bridge some of these gaps and learn from each other's, expertise on tools and that are used in particular spaces of refugee rights and the anti-torture initiatives. And I think that I will just then maybe pass over, if there's no further questions. I think then just closing remarks from both of you. Anything that you would like to say as a closing on this subject? Actually, one thing that I wanted to say that I just remembered is that I think that we all recognize that even when we're talking about migrants and refugees and stateless communities, we understand that there is internal, layers of discrimination and vulnerability within these communities. So, for example, when we talk about stateless communities, women that are stateless or children that are stateless have a different experience that needs to be also looked at distinctly, even from a COVID standpoint. So while of course we need to also look at the communities as a whole, because there's so little information on trying to identify impacts on them, but at the same time, within these communities, the women and the girls or other minorities, they also need to be looked at. And so I'll just hand it over to you guys for any concluding observations, comments, thoughts.
Yeah, I can just go first. That's fine, Rana. Yeah. So just I just have one comment in terms of the last point, Fatma, which is in terms of responding to and including groups such as children and women within the broader conversation. So I think that's something that has been missing even post-pandemic, the response and also the data that's being gathered. One of the concerns that it highlights is that if we're looking at something like COVID-19 and the impact of it on education, there is no disaggregation of that impact in terms of children within the refugee community, which is really problematic because that experience is very different from children who are citizens of Pakistan living in urban communities or rural communities, and their access is very different. So I do think that there is a gap in terms of information that is being gathered during the pandemic, but also post-pandemic. And I think this may relate to some extent to the idea that, when we're looking at vulnerable groups like children, we look at them as a whole, and we don't look into the deeper disaggregations oftentimes. But perhaps the pandemic is a learning experience for why it's very important to include those disaggregations in general into both, the response of UN entities, but also the response of national organizations as well as regional bodies in terms of these groups. So yeah, just gonna close with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And then to sort of add on to that, I think, Sevim, that's a really excellent point. I think one of the real gaps is, and even in this conversation, it's been very difficult to address that, is the particular vulnerabilities of certain populations who've particularly suffered during the pandemic. So undocumented migrants or stateless persons, anybody who's not been able to access support through either, through government initiatives or UNHCR, and essentially they have been a completely forgotten population. There is almost no data on their experiences. And even if there is some access to vaccination, not healthcare, just to distinguish between the two, sometimes these particular groups are fearful of access. And so we never really know, and we can't get good data, we can't really understand the extent of the problem and of the numbers of people who are really require this assistance. And it's something that I think we as NGOs and as others should really be looking more carefully at. And I know that many of you are, but I feel like we as a regional organisation could benefit from taking good examples from particular jurisdictions and sharing them with others. I also wanted to add to your point about torture language, Fatima. I thought that was a really important point to make, and that maybe we should be exploring that further. I think there's been a kind of reticence to do so, partly because just looking at it from a refugee status determination perspective, So often that's where we look at it from that perspective. I think there's been sometimes a misdefinition of what torture is, and people often, when we're looking at asylum claims, confusing what torture is with this, and people not necessarily being open to understanding or until legislation eventually shows it to be true. I mean, people not allowing that definition of torture to be used in its true wider sense. So I feel like that is something we should be exploring much more. And and I'm excited about future conversations we'll be having. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rana. Thank you very much, Salim. Thank you very much to all the participants that have joined us. This is Nadine, our 7th webinar, I think, consecutive.
The 6th one. Tomorrow is the 7th one.
Well, feels like.
Feels like it, actually, yes.
So I think I've been really excited for this conversation because I think it's just so important to talk about this. And I know that because of the data, we just really have personal experiences, of actors and organizations that have been working in jurisdictions, but it's so important for us to gather together to, collect them, even if that is, through a conversation and share them in the limited way that we can. But I really do look forward to, keeping in touch, in my individual capacity as well, but also as A3T, to look more closely at how we can, incorporate a priority on refugees and migrants and stateless communities within our larger anti-torture work, or the work that we do against authoritarianism in countries, or impunity or rights-based abuses. I think there is a clear mandate that we can look into violations that are there for these communities, and there is that added reason to do so. But I think now we'll just kind of see what's the best way to go about building that sort of support framework, and where to start from that. And I think this is a great start, the conversation. And thank you again for your time. And I think I'm ready to close this conversation for now. The first part of it, at least.
Okay, so thank you again. Let me re-spotlight myself. Hold on. Okay, hi again. Thank you so much for speakers as well as Fatima for moderating this very, very important theme that we have discussed a lot today. And I see that several participants in the YouTube have expressed their thanks as well to all of you. So again, it is very grateful for us to invite Savim and then Rana and other speakers that have been participating since day 1 webinar. Don't forget, we still have day 7 until day 11 of our webinars. So yes, I know, right, Rana? So we still have 5 more to go. And let's just not wait much longer. So we will continue again for tomorrow's event at 6 p.m. Nepal time. Thank you again, Fatima, and then Savim and Rana. I'm Nadine Sherani signing out for today's webinar. And I will close today's broadcast as well, and by closing today's Zoom. Thank you all. Have a nice evening from Jakarta.
You all too.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.